Well, we should crack on then. Felix, it's wonderful to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the ninth session of our Insight into Games month here at Ukie, which is very exciting. Felix, it's like I say, you're from Lvl Up Partners, and you're here to talk to us today about debugging a publishing agreement, looking at all the sort of pitfalls and the things that you really need to know your onions about when it comes to, well, getting a game published and signing into something like this. So yeah, would you like to take it away?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Leo. And, thanks to you and Ukie for inviting me on this program. So yeah, really honored to be part of it. So cool. Yeah, I'm Felix. I'll just give a brief bit of background about myself before I dive in. So um, cool. So I am a freelance games lawyer. So I focus on indies and entrepreneurs only. I don't really work for AAA, and definitely don't do any work outside games. So very much a sector specialist. I used to be senior counsel slash lead lawyer at a few studios like Mediatonic, Miniclip, Epic Games. And 3 years ago-ish, I decided to go freelance, and that led me to work with lots more indie studios, and just having a lot of fun. You can see my cheesy little tagline in the corner there. I'm a lawyer on Slack or a lawyer on Discord for indies. So really trying to be that kind of one-stop shop for any legal support that indie studios need. Now, yeah, this is a nice segue because through that experience I had the opportunity to see lots and lots of publishing agreements. And that led me last year to actually develop a mock publishing agreement, which I think was linked to in the invite. There's also the QR code if anyone needs it there. Um, and yeah, the purpose of that agreement was really to address the knowledge gap between what are often first-time indie developers looking at publisher agreement and the publisher who is naturally, as part of their model, looks at these things day in, day out, and knows all the tricks and the little tips and things. So I really wanted to give an idea to devs of what agreement could look like, but also B, call out some red flags that developers could look at. And, as with all things in life, prevention is 1,000 times better than cure. And I kind of, it's still sad. I often, particularly in this environment in the industry, I get indies coming up to me and say, oh, there's this thing I didn't quite realize in the contract. How do I get out of that now? And, it's kind of difficult. And so what I want to do is try and preempt all that. So before I dive straight in, just a few, more sleepy disclaimers. Yeah, obviously not legal advice, but more importantly, all publishing agreements are different. It depends a lot on not just the parties, but the game, the genre, and also the relative contributions of the parties, because you get a slightly different dynamic and a slightly different risk setup each time. And so, although I call out particular things as red flags, it can really depend on the situation. And sometimes in a particular set of circumstances, something which, might look a bit more offensive is actually more understandable. So, yeah, as always, make sure if you're unsure, get proper advice. Cool. So this is what the agreement looks like if you click on the link, and you can see my comments down the side. And what I will do in this session is I won't go through this line by line, obviously, but I'll call out some of the points I've also called out in the agreement, and just dwell on those and discuss, what are the different things to look out for. I've also got a little box if you've got another monitor. You could have the agreement side by side. I'll reference the clause references here so you can track what I'm talking about. Cool. So straight into it then. I think the first point I call out in the agreement is the definition of game. And so obviously it's absolutely critical that the game is defined properly. And sometimes you can see slightly too broad definitions of game, which covers things that aren't meant to be covered. And so oftentimes those will be ports and sequels. So with ports, the key question is have you agreed platform specific rights with the publisher? So there should have been some sort of commercial discussion before you've got to the long form stage. And the question is, if you've agreed a platform specific deal, then naturally the contract should reflect those narrow platforms you've agreed to. I'd say in the indie space now, it's more common for publishers to ask for encompassing rights across all platforms, whether current and future. And there's lots of good reasons for that. Naturally, publishers don't want to step on each other's toes, and marketing is such a key part of publishing that you don't want to step on each other's toes when it comes to those kind of beats and things like that. But if you have, in circumstances, agreed particular platform-specific rights, those should all be reflected. So the game definition needs to be mindful of that. Onto sequels, these should pretty much rarely be covered point blank in the agreement as part of the game, because that would mean that you're giving away your future rights to the future publishing rights of the sequels to your game. So these should almost always be treated as a separate item or in the agreement, or frankly excluded from the agreement altogether, and treated, essentially that would be a separate agreement in the future if it came to it. And publishers have generally they use three different types of clauses when they deal with sequels and sometimes ports. And so just to go through those quickly, you get rights of first negotiation, which are the softest of these rights, where essentially the publisher is saying, okay, give me an exclusive window for me to discuss a sequel proposal from you. And that's called it 30 days, 45 days, 60 days. But then, there's no strings attached to that chat. We'll just talk about it. And, if we've done a good job, then hopefully you want to negotiate with us after that period and we can agree a new contract. But with this right, at the end of that period, the developers can always, there's no strings. They're not forced to sign anything. They're just having a chat, and then they can go to other publishers after that window's expired. The second type of right you see are rights of first refusal. The devil really is in the detail of these, because rights of first refusal, and you also get rights of first offers, it can mean different things to different people, even lawyers. And so you really need someone to look at that quite closely, because what they will do is add a lot more teeth to that window of exclusivity, where you may be required to actually sign up to a new agreement for the sequel if the terms are fulfill certain criteria, or if the publisher says yes, I want to do it. There's normally a bit more legal teeth in here that you need to be careful of. And then lastly, you've got last matching rights, which is something I would say is a tad more aggressive from a publisher, and something as a developer you need to be a bit more careful of. So what are those? Well, what those mean is that if we go through the right of first refusal, so you go to a publisher with a sequel proposal and you say, look, I want to make this game. They then refuse. That means that you can then go to third-party publishers to pitch the game. And let's say you go to publisher B and they say, awesome, here's an offer. Last matching rights require you, the dev, to go back to your existing publisher with that term sheet and say, can you match this? Or you've got the right to match this. And if the first publisher says yes, then you have to go with them. And that can be quite cumbersome in your kind of pitch process, because you're kind of messing around with parties, and it can mean that actually it reduces your bargaining power quite a bit in these discussions. So generally, I would say, unless there's a good reason, I would think about pushing back on this last matching rights concept in the publishing agreement. Cool. Onto probably the most critical item in the document, which is the revenue share. This is the most common source of I guess secondhand PTSD that I get from publishing contracts, which is oftentimes developers don't fully understand the revenue share, and it's got to a point where our publishing contracts in this industry are quite sophisticated now, and so there are lots of different levers you can pull. It's not just a straight 50-50. There are lots of defined terms which are critical, and different ways you can skin the cat, basically. And so what I would always suggest to developers is just make sure you really understand and math out and model out the different kind of best case scenario, medium case, worst case scenario of how does the upside and the downside, and i.e. the profits and the costs, how do they get split between the two parties, so you understand what you're getting into. Because it's oftentimes when you do that model and that process, you realize, oh, right, okay, if I pull this lever, it's actually better, so I should pick this battle rather than that. So just to dive in a bit more detail, and I appreciate this may be super obvious to lots of people, but just to take a few steps back, with the revenue share, if we look at the blue diagram here, at its simplest, we've got gross revenue at the top, which is the top of the funnel, which is basically referring to all the revenue generated from the actual, sales of the games on the platforms. That's gross revenue. You then deduct certain permitted deductions, and then you get to net revenue. And net revenue is what you split between you and the publisher. And so the first thing to say is that terminology, people say gross revenue, gross receipts, and then different phrases, it generally all mean the kind of refer to the same thing. But again, the devil is in detail with what we mean by gross revenue. So just having gone through that structure, it's obvious that gross revenue, from the developer point of view, you want that to be as wide as possible, right? Because the wider that is, that means when you get to net revenue, you should be part of a bigger pie. So key question here I always ask is everything included? Because if the publisher has got things like, rights over ancillary things and derivative works, that should all be included as part of the gross revenue, so it flows through the waterfall. Another key thing to look out for are subscription agreements. So we all know about Game Pass and other exclusivity deals that you can get with platforms where you get, or upfront payments. Those are sometimes not fully captured because gross revenue will sometimes refer to just the actual money from the unit sales of the game. And if you're signing a Game Pass contract, there's not actually any unit sales up front, right? You're just being paid a lump sum, or the publisher's being paid from by the platform a lump sum. So you want to make sure those types of subscription fees, upfront fees, minimum guarantees, whatever you call them, they're all part of gross revenue. So you widen that funnel as much as possible. Then you get to deductions, and again, stating the obvious, you want deductions from the developer point of view to be as tight and as narrow and as short as possible, because the less you deduct, the more that's left in net revenue. So you want to check this list, is an exhaustive list. It generally should be. Are there any kind of cheeky deductions in there? And what I would class as cheeky would be things like the publisher trying to deduct their internal costs, their internal marketing team costs or their internal QA costs. Generally speaking, those should not be deductible, and they should be, for the publisher's own internal cost to bear fully. So I would make sure or test those if you see those in the contract, and then also check if there's any approvals built in. So for some of these deductions, there may be you've agreed that okay, certain types of spend, let's say porting costs, they should be approved by you beforehand, in which case make sure that in the deductible part it says that any porting costs are as agreed between you and the publisher. So yeah, the deductions, make sure they're tight before you get to net revenue. And then yeah, recoupment is the final main kind of lever that can be used here. It's a very common structure proposed by publishers. What that means is if you look at the diagram in green, before the publisher splits net revenue, they will look to recoup some of their own costs, and that could be on marketing, for example. And so they recoup normally all their costs fully from net revenue before the split happens. And so there are a few considerations here, and actually a few red flags here, I would say, which is if a publisher is going for recoupment, which is quite common, then make sure that is against the aggregate net revenue, and it's not against the net revenue that you would receive after the split. Because let's say if it's a 50-50 split, and the recoupment by publisher is only against your share, and it's 50-50, what essentially is happening, if you model that out, it means the publisher is going to recoup twice of that recoupable amount before you get to the split. So that can be buried, and I've seen it in, sadly, a few quite big, more popular publisher contracts, but it's something which I feel is it should be tested quite thoroughly. The second point I would flag here is some of the more indie friendly publishers will offer a recoup, offer a revenue share during their recoup. So in other words, they won't take 100% of the net revenue before it gets to split. They will say, look, okay, I appreciate you need to keep the lights on, etc., etc. I will recoup at an 85% or a 70% rate. So, while we're recouping, you still get paid 70% of the net revenue, which is, that's a green flag, if we're talking about those as well, from a publisher. So yeah, a few more red flags to just to throw in there, because this is such a critical clause of the contract. That I've seen also sometimes publishers demand that the revenue share only kicks in at a certain period, and because I would say the revenue share and what we've all just been discussing should kick in day one as soon as the publisher receives any kind of amount in its bank from the exploitation of the game. And sometimes I see publishing actually, we're going to discount early access, for example, and we're only going to accrue the revenue that's payable to you, developer, from full commercial release. Now, we all know that early access is not a small thing anymore, and so lots of money is made there, and it doesn't seem right to me that that point is pushed. So that's something that I would, kick very hard if the revenue share doesn't kick in basically day one. I'd also be suspicious of reductions of revenue share. So you may have a headline, again, let's just call it 50-50, but there are some publishers that will say, okay, well, we're going to have some punitive clauses in there. Let's say you delay the game by 3 months. Every 3 months of your delay, we're going to adjust the revenue share by 5%. So you reduce by 5%, we go up by 5%, something like that. And kind of together that I've seen kind of forfeiture clauses or suspension of revenue share clauses. I would say, generally speaking, from in the agreements I've seen, all these types of clauses are quite aggressive, and there may be certain circumstances where you can negotiate around them and they're more reasonable. But generally, I would say they are red flags, and I would test them quite hard. It's not really in the spirit of the agreement. And generally, where you get to these big ticket events, the publisher has got other kind of levers it can pull in that scenario, before it gets to forfeiture or suspension of revenue share, which puts a hell of a lot of pressure on you as the dev studio. Come take a quick drink. Okay, so moving on to IP ownership, I'd say it's almost a given now that this is not a contested point. So all publishers, particularly at the indie level, should just be saying pretty flatly in their agreements that the developer has 100% ownership. And it's, the concept of the publisher acquiring IP, it is, you do see it in the odd case, but it requires, again, a very unique set of circumstances. And it's something that I would say a lot of more of the older school publishers will push for. And generally, I would say no, developers should always keep 100%. I've seen concepts of fractional IP ownership where the publisher would say, well, I'm going to take, just a 0.1% of your IP, and even if that kind of practically works, I'm not sure it does. Oftentimes the rationale from the publisher is them saying, well, I need that fractional percentage because I need to deal with your clones, and all these pirated games that will come out once this game goes blockbuster, because they will say, for me to properly protect my publishing rights, I need to go to the various platforms and say, look, I have the sole rights to distribute this game, and this other clone needs to be taken down. And the platform will say to me, I can only do that if I can show ownership. So that's why I need to have some sort of ownership in the IP for me to properly enforce that protection for the benefit of us all. It's a reasonable argument, but actually it's not as black and white as that. And I personally handled takedowns where a publisher doesn't have this fractional IP ownership. It definitely helps, but I would say it's overkill to require ownership for that purpose. And I would push back on that because once you have fractional ownership of your assets, it stores up other legal problems for you down the line, which are just not worth it. And other areas, trademark registrations, a publisher will sometimes say, okay, let me register the trademarks on your behalf. And so I'll be the owner of the trademarks on the registries. And that to me is, again, for similar reasons, it's understandable that they want that so they can enforce the trademark rights, but not strictly necessary. It does help them. It's less offensive to me than the fractional ownership point, but I would say if you're doing that, make sure you've got transfer back clauses. So when the agreement terminates, those trademark registrations, there are clauses where the publisher is required to transfer those back to you because once the agreement ends, they shouldn't be holding on to those. Second point here is a publisher, they'll be creating marketing assets and copy and store pages and that kind of stuff that will use your works, right? They will be creating trailers and stuff. Commonly, they will engage those a third party produce those trailers. So you won't be party to that contract as a dev studio. So you want, because it's your IP ultimately, the IP in those trailers should flow back to you as a dev studio. So what you need in the contract is an assignment back, which again isn't always in the contract. And in my mock publishing agreement isn't actually, don't think is there. So it's one thing to look out for. And then the final point here is just watch out for other kind of slightly cheeky or backdoor transfers of IPs in other clauses, such as a termination event. Cool.
We've had a small question in
Yeah.
the chat actually, which is quite relevant just here. I mean, you mentioned sort of fractional IP ownership. I mean, what are some of the complications that could be caused by entering into that kind of arrangement sort of further down the line? You sort of hinted at a couple, but it'd be helpful just to understand what that might look
Yeah.
like.
Yeah,
Like
yeah. So the
global.
most obvious one would be, let's say you want to sell the IP or potentially even sell the studio, and if that is at all, a possibility in the future, any buyer is going to do their due diligence in the IP, and they're going to value your company off the back of your game and your IP. And if you don't own that 100%, it creates a lot of problems in that scenario because then they need to make sure that the other owners of the IP, such as the publisher, even if it is a small stake, sell the IP together as part of that transaction. And at that point, a more hard-nosed publisher who smells something like that going on could demand, more of a payment to get that IP back across.
Okay, that's interesting. There's another question here, just quickly, actually, on sort of trademarking and whether, if you're a small indie, whether it should be sort of make sense to be left up to the publisher. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, great question. The issue with trademarks is that they are actually quite costly to properly do. So trademarks, it's all jurisdiction specific. So you can get a trademark in the UK and you need to file with the UK Intellectual Property Office, but that will only cover the UK. And because we're a global business, obviously you want to cover quite a number of territories. You want the whole of the EU, and they do have a harmonized EU trademark regime, but you want the US, probably want the other English speaking countries and maybe Asia as well. And the costs for those can add up like massively, particularly if your trademark isn't a simple one. We're talking kind of tens of thousands. So normally it's harder for an indie to do it themselves. What I would suggest is in the UK, it's not that expensive to just do a UK only trademark, and that can at least put you on the register and gives people notice that you've got a registered filing there, which can help. So I would say it's a balance between how much cash you've got to apply to these things and when you do it. If I would try and do it once you've got kind of pretty much full confidence in the project, which is coming up to release, that you start incurring these costs. If the publisher wants to do it ahead of time, that I think that is reasonable. We just need to make sure you've got safeguards in there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Yeah, you should crack on.
Yeah, cool. So next clause I picked out was on the approval timeframes. And as you see from the contract, almost all publishing agreements are milestone based. There are definitely some publishing agreements out there that aren't, but by and large, 95% of them are, which means that you only get paid development fees from the publisher when they approve a particular milestone. So for development studios, again, particularly in this climate, cash flow is absolutely critical. And so what I'm calling out here are, okay, what are the timeframes for you from submission of a build to being paid for that build? And if you have long approval timeframes, it can really impact, your cash flow basically. So, this is pretty worst case scenario I've set out in the mock agreement, but we've gone with 20 business days. So on day one, you submit the build. Let's say it gets to the endish of that 20 business days timing. 29, you receive feedback. And remember, you might not automatically get approved on the first submission, so you might need to spend some time resubmitting. The publisher provides more feedback, it's approved, hooray. You then send the invoice straight away the day after, but they then goes to their finance team and they've got their own separate timelines of, let's say it's net 30 days for the invoice payment. So you've gone from basically an 80-day time period from submission until payment, which that is a long time and can, if cash flow is tight, be really problematic. So we can think about different ways of dealing with that risk. And so there are a number of things you can do. One is to obviously shorten the approval timeframes. And from going from the 20 business day period down to 10 business days would be great. I think 5 business days is probably pushing it, but 10 business days, 15 business days is pretty good. A second concept you could try and introduce is around deemed publisher approval. So that means that if a publisher doesn't respond or doesn't respond in time, then should there be a mechanism where the milestone is approved, or at least approved for payment purposes, so you're not kind of cash flow screwed. So this can be a bit more delicate. Some publishers just have a philosophical reaction against this, and you can kind of understand why, in that they will never want to pay out on a build that they have actually not approved, right? They will want to inspect that, and it will be kind of for their own stakeholders, their own board, it will be kind of mad for them to have paid out if they haven't actually approved, and it might be for certain reasons out of their control that they've not managed to approve it. But I would say it's becoming more common in the publishing agreements for this deemed publisher approval process to apply. And I would say it's obviously a green flag if you've got that in your contract. You would also try and get some protective language more generally against publisher delays. So, just trying to basically say, if there are deadlines in the contract and those deadlines are breached because of a publisher has just not responded or not given feedback or not given something that's a prerequisite to your submission, then this language would help you not be in contractual breach. Shorten the invoice payment timeframes. Again, it's more obvious. So normally there's a separate time frame for invoice payments. Try and get that down. Standard for all businesses is around net 30, which means they've got 30 days from receipt of invoice. Try and get that way down. 10 days, 15 days. The smaller the publisher, the more nimble they will be, and the more flexible they'll be able to be with, their finance processes. If you're dealing with a huge publisher, it's going to be harder to push this because, they're dealing with so many contracts. They want consistency. So try and pick your battles there. And then also just having clear termination rights around lack of payment, and we'll come on to those later. But yeah, ultimately, if the publisher doesn't pay, then that should give rise to a breach of contract and potential termination right. The next point is around publisher commitments, and this is one where I'll be on thinner ice with publishers. And the disclaimer, I do work with some publishers, and I obviously try to work with all the indie-friendly ones, but publisher views can vary quite a bit here. Some will feel stronger than others on this slide, and there are a few things to break down. One is marketing commitments, a cornerstone of why you go to a publisher, apart from money to develop the game, would be their actual marketing abilities and their firepower, financial firepower to commit to marketing spend with influences and performance campaigns. And so the question should always come up and should always be discussed of, okay, what's the marketing commitment, and should there be a minimum in the contract, for example, so that I know that you as a publisher, you've got 12, 20 games, let's say, in your portfolio, and this game's going to come out in 2 years. Can we put something in there that makes sure that you're not going to be distracted in 2 years' time and feel that actually you want to focus all your efforts and your resources somewhere else? So could we put something that says on launch, X amount will be committed to marketing? Publishers, as I said, have different philosophical views about this. Some will say, oh, I really don't like that because you're kind of forcing me to spend, and it may be that the spend is unwise in those circumstances. And this needs to be marketing is not just a single binary dial where you move up how much you spend and you get the return. It needs to be something that's quite nuanced and agreed. And what I would say is just make sure you have that conversation, and you understand the publisher position. And again, I think more importantly, check out their track record of what they've done, because if they say something like that, and you can see that with their previous games, oh, they have, actually put in the funds, then that gives you more reassurance. Um, oh, sorry, I just, oh, sorry, yes, just sorting out a message. Um, um, oh, sorry, Leo just mentioned I'm still on the wrong slide. Oh, strange.
No, so you're on the
Um,
right slide now, but there does appear to be a bit of a lag. That was all.
oh, sorry,
It takes a
apologies.
couple of minutes to come through. That's all right.
Yeah, I'll ramble on in the wilderness.
That's fine.
So yeah, the other consideration could be a maximum of marketing spend, and this is kind of seems kind of counterintuitive, but this really depends on the recruitment model and the financial structure that you've agreed, as we discussed in the earlier slide. Because sometimes if a publisher is recouping all of their costs first, it can mean that there there is a risk, and again, this is in the cynical lens of things, that they are a bit more relaxed with spending on marketing budgets, because ultimately they will recoup that first from the incoming revenue. So sometimes you might want to consider a maximum or having some sort of approval right. It really comes back on both these points to the financial incentives, but it's something to at the very least think about. Release commitment is another one to think about, which is, you don't want the publisher just sitting on your game. So, if they've got a long term to publish your game, then you want them to release the game pretty much as soon as possible once you provide them with the final Gold Master build. So you want something, you want to at least discuss with the publisher what is your release timeline, what is your commitment. Um, and then, yeah, two of the points quickly here are on the publisher commitments. Yeah, if they've pitched you certain things, and commonly it's things around creative control and not touching, the art direction, or the kind of overall vision of the game. Try and bake that into the contract where it's something more tangible to you. Oftentimes, they can be overlooked, but if the publisher is true to their word, then they shouldn't really have a problem with that being reflected in the contract. Okay. I've changed slides to post-release developments. Hopefully that's you can see that. This is about what happens post-release. And I think this is more of an acute issue where you have a game with a long tail kind of DLC plan, or any game with kind of live ops, so particularly mobile games and free to play. You need to be really clear on what those expectations are, and to the extent you need to reflect those in the contract. And so what you can sometimes see, and what I've flagged in the mock agreement, is that there's wording that is pretty wide and talks about developers generally just going to develop whatever the publisher, requests, which, for the period up to release is pretty certain in that you've got the milestone schedule. But for stuff after that, you need to be quite careful that you're not locking yourself in to work on a game which it may be commercially less successful, or because of the revenue share, the upside is decent for the publisher, but it's not as great for you, and you're working at an effectively, unfavorable rate where your time could be spent on, potentially other things, other projects. So you just need to be very clear on what your post-release development obligations are, and they extend to bigger ticket items like DLC and live bots, but also bug fixing, maintenance, and I've made a note about the broader language as well. And this will tie into termination rights, which we'll come to later. But let's say in 5 years' time, if there's a game breaking, well, maybe that's not say it's not game breaking. Let's just say there's a material bug in the game. If the game is not really making any sales, should you still be required to have to work on that? So so long after release, it's just something just to bear in mind. So to that point, the term of the contract. So how long does the publisher have their rights for? This can vary quite wildly. 5 to 10 years is kind of a ballpark range, and I think the longer terms are becoming a bit more common even for indies. So you can get perpetual terms, or sometimes expressed as the commercial life of the game, or 10 years. I would say publishers now, they're really focused on back catalogue, a lot of them, because again, in the current market and the competitive nature of new releases, it's just a lot harder to have consistent hits. So the back catalogue is really important, which means they want to extend this term out. And I would say it's definitely a point to try and negotiate if you can, but it's not one I would die in a ditch over, because if you've got sufficient protections in the other parts of your contract, you should be more comfortable with a longer term. Which leads me on to termination, and I've also seen some messages. So just responding to Dennis's question around, is it common for publishers to require support from developers for an extended amount of time after any content update? So it can surprisingly be, the contract can be silent on this a lot of times, but publishers, where they do have a clause, that can be quite broad if you're not negotiating it. So it can just say sometimes that the developer deals with all bugs, like full stop. And so that's one way I would obviously test quite rigorously, both in terms of the type of bugs that need to be fixed post-release and the time frame of that obligation. But I would make it a discussion point, even if the contract is silent, just so again you're being super upfront with the expectations. Right, determination, not an area that people love to dwell on, but lawyers naturally live in this world, this dark side. So I would say again, if we just look to, the headlines in the past 18 months with publishers, some publishers, folding or terminations happening. I think these types of clauses, are more important to look at in today's landscape. So normally with a termination clause, you have broadly three kind of categories of termination right. You've got your mutual right on either side to terminate if the other side breaches. That, is a standard contractual term in any commercial agreement. You've then got your publisher right to walk away, which is again very common and pretty standard in publishing agreements. And then you've got your very boilerplate rights to terminate on an insolvency event of the other party if they've declared that they have to go into administration or whatever. It's very common in any contract to have the third category as well. So just looking at the mutual right first, I mean, this is your right as a developer to terminate the contract if there's a breach by the publisher. So I'm amazed I have to say this, but just make sure that's in the contract. You do have rights under kind of just common law and basic law to terminate a contract, but contractually it should be a pretty non-controversial point to say, okay, if publisher you mess up, then I can terminate, and that could mean not paying or not respecting your approval rights, all that kind of stuff. So that is your real teeth behind lots of the obligations in the contract. So which is why I call it the kind of sleeper agent, which is you hardly will ever take a publisher to court, but you want that there as the kind of background under supposition so that everyone respects the contract. Second point I've made is just on the termination for convenience. It does feel odd to first-time developers that there's this one-way right for the publisher just to walk away, and that can and does often leave developers hanging. And I think this type of right, again, just have a chat with the publisher and test it. It can be more, you may be able to negotiate it away in a particular arrangement where, for example, the publisher's invested less into your project. Let's say it's a marketing only deal and they're putting in minimum amounts of money of their own at risk. Then you could argue, well, you shouldn't just be able to walk away like that. I think it's more it's basically definitely a point to discuss with the publisher, but I wouldn't get too emotional about it because it is such a standard concept now that a publisher should have the flexibility to kind of reprioritize their kind of titles essentially. What it does mean though is that can you argue for any protection in this downside case? Because if the publisher terminates in the middle of development, that means that your game is kind of half finished and you don't have the funds to finish. So what I would push for as a developer is a way to get payments for the next milestone, or maybe the one after that, to try and get some compensation to tide you over during that period. Because again, it comes back to cash flow risks. And feasibly, are you feasibly going to find a new publisher to plug straight into the gap if someone's just walked away? So we just want to think about hard there. And then the final point here, which some publishers will hate me for saying, but is think about a developer termination right. If you've got specific concerns, I mean, you will not get the same right to walk away like a publisher does, precisely because of the point I've just said, which is a publisher will have invested normally amounts into the game, and so it's not right that you can just walk away and their costs are essentially sunk into your project. If you've got specific concerns, then let's say you're worried about the publisher, or you've seen from that track record that maybe they sit on their hands, then maybe there's cause for a termination right there where you can say, look, if you've not launched the game by X date within us submitting the code master and you approving it, then the developer, we can terminate the contract, which seems pretty fair. But it's something to test. Some publishers will, not because they're necessarily evil, they will just have a philosophical view against this. Conscious of the time, I know we might have more questions at the end. I will accelerate a bit through these last few slides, and Leo, do jump in if I'm rambling too long. Non-competes, very common in publishing agreements. I've got one in the mock agreement. There are two variables in non-compete. One is the scope of restriction, as in what games can you, the developer, not work on. And the second variable is what's the period of the non-compete? How long are you restricted for? And you could get comfortable, for example, if the period was super short, even if the scope was wide, and vice versa. So it's definitely important to look at both of those together. What I would say is, again, some developers can be quite emotional about this, because I understand this is a non-compete is essentially saying, we're restricting your creative freedom from developing these other projects. But from the publisher's point of view, what they're really trying to protect is their investment in the game. So, if they've paid X amount into your development costs, they want to stop you from doing games that could compete with your with a game that you're working on, or games that come too close. So yeah, I would say this is always a negotiation, and the first language from a publisher is can be wider, but I would just think quite critically about your own plans and the type of game that you're working on. Is it something that you could foresee coming close to in future? Equity related clauses. So in the mock publishing agreement, I put in a clause that says the publisher has the option to subscribe for shares in the developer. And the point I'm trying to make here is that equity clauses that basically allow the publisher to take ownership of part of your studio and the company rather than the project, you know, as a kind of default position, should not be in the contract unless there's a good reason, or unless they're soft. The one I've got in the mock contract is quite hard. It's a direct right for the publisher to subscribe for options or shares in your company. And there's a risk there that a publisher is essentially kind of double dipping into the upside there. The argument from a publisher for this is to say, well, if this game goes gangbusters and your company starts getting approached by Microsoft and EA for an acquisition, all that value that you're going to receive from selling your company, a lot of it will be down to us as a publisher from, taking a bet on you and developing this game. So the kind of counter argument to that is, well, that's why we negotiated the rev share, and that's why you're getting all the upside from, if the game has done well, from all the the revenue waterfall. And if you're going to take part of the studio as well, you're kind of getting your cake and eating it. So there's a danger that it warps the usual publisher developer kind of financial equilibrium here, and there are lots of other risks which is a subject for another session, but it's something to test quite hard. You can get softer rights around equity, like again, like we said earlier on, rights to negotiate. That's all pretty reasonable. But anything harder, you definitely need specialist advice. Someone that knows their way around the kind of corporate law aspects as well. Quick one on ancillary rights. Yeah, transmedia, I think it's less of a buzzword nowadays, but it's still kicking around. All I'd say is the value really depends on the game, and just make sure again that if there are ancillary rights granted to the publisher, make sure it's reflected properly in the agreement in terms of what those rights are. Is there a different revenue share that applies to those? Do you have approval rights? And I think also fundamentally, what is the publisher's track record with these? Because if they say they want to make a film out of your game, well, they're not a film studio, so what they're going to be doing is essentially contracting out those rights to an actual film studio, in which case they become a middleman. When it's the question there is, okay, what's the value that you're adding there if you're becoming the middleman? And then I think this is my penultimate slide, the milestone schedule. I would just basically say with this, just be realistic and be honest. I don't think there's much point playing games with publishers on what the dev costs will be. The thing to really hone in on is, well, two things. One is the cash flow point again. So you need to think about worst case scenario if milestones are delayed or you have to resubmit. And so you may be able to argue a signing payment, in other words, a day one payment when you sign the contract. So you get a bit of buffer day one, which is helpful. And the other thing is, to the extent you can, appreciating that things will always change, try to align expectations and have as much detail. And when you talk about, the vertical slice or whatever, again, that can mean different things to different people. Make sure you kind of align on what that is, and if you can, put it into the schedule. So yeah, final thoughts here. Yeah, knowledge is power. So there are so many resources nowadays. Obviously, attending this session, everyone gets huge brownie points for that. But there's so much stuff on YouTube and Google that just if you're ever in doubt and you don't want to go to advice for whatever reason, then just educate yourself. Having said that, I would always, of course, advise appointing the right advisors. Make sure it's someone that actually knows the industry and gets the terminology. Pick your battles. Yeah, you can sometimes put off a publisher if you go back on everything. So try and be pragmatic with the points that you really care about. Also, reverse DD, in other words, check out the publisher and their track record. There are lots and lots and lots of indie publishers now of varying quality. I think almost all of them have good intentions, but the question is, do they have the track record and the kind of the skill set and the connections to really do what you want? Make sure you check that out. And having that relationship is paramount. The contract, I will say this as a lawyer, but the best case scenario for a contract is that it just gathers dust in a drawer. Right? It's important to get it right in case of the worst case, but the main thing is you've got a good relationship with your publisher, so you don't even need to revisit this stuff. And then finally, don't underestimate your bargaining power. So everyone has imposter syndrome. Everyone worries that the deal is going to evaporate. But if you've got to the point where you've got a contract from a publisher, it normally means that they're pretty much really bought into your game. So don't feel worried that you just have to accept everything and roll over. Cool. So that was the session. Got a few minutes left for questions, and I can also ramble on with other thoughts if there are none.
No, that was really fascinating, Felix. I think there's an awful lot to take away from that. Lots and lots to consider. We'll stay open for a little bit for any questions. Obviously, your details are in the event and I'll pop them onto the YouTube video as well. And I've shared a link to your publishing agreement, your mock publishing agreement there as well. So
Yeah,
we've got a
to you.
message from Harvey. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I was going to say, everyone can feel free just to reach out, and that's my LinkedIn page and my email. Honestly, don't hesitate. I am generally trying to be an indie friendly lawyer, so yeah, happy to answer questions as and when. So yeah,